Well, it is good to see everybody here this evening, especially visitors that we have with us tonight. We certainly do hope that if you have any questions about the Monte Vista Church of Christ, that you'll let us know after the worship service. I know there are a number of folks who are Christians here this evening who are visiting with us, but if we do have anybody who's not already a Christian in this assembly tonight, then we hope that your time with us this evening will be edifying and educational. And again, the invitation is always there that if you have questions about our faith and the way that we conduct ourselves as a congregation, then we are more than willing and very happy to talk to you about those things. Of course, tonight's lesson is going to be a bit interesting. With Halloween coming up in the next couple weeks, I thought it might be appropriate for us to consider some of the things that we are typically afraid of this time of year. Really, I say we in the most accommodative sense. The world has things that it's terrified about, things that really don't make a whole lot of sense to the person who's studied the Bible. Things like ghosts, zombies, and UFOs. And you're thinking, I'm sure glad that we're going to be spending a worship hour talking about ghosts, zombies, and UFOs. And yet I will say that there's a lot of value for the Christian to at least have an answer for these things. I don't believe that it's a waste of our time to consider what the world believes about them and really what the Bible has to say about them. And the reason why I say that is this. In John chapter 8, notice in John 8 verses 32 and 36, John 8, 32 and 36 says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And again in verse 36, "If therefore the Son of God shall make you free, you shall be free indeed." And yet, how many of you, if you've watched The Walking Dead or anything like that, how many of you would be pretty terrified of the concept of ghosts, zombies, or UFOs? I wonder if I was to poll all of you, put up a question up here with multiple choice or something like that, and I was to say something like, of all of these things, what do you find the most frightening? A, raccoons. B, staph infection. Or C, a zombie outbreak. What's the most terrifying one of those things? And yet the thing is, zombies aren't real. So why would we be afraid of them? Raccoons are a whole lot more scary than zombies because raccoons carry rabies. And they're everywhere. I tell you, there are a few animals in this world that I think can survive in any environment. Okay? Cockroaches, for one, rats and raccoons. You find raccoons on almost any place on this planet and they're thriving. They're thriving. So why are we so afraid of something like zombies? Why are we so afraid of ghost stories when we can read in the Bible and know just exactly what is happening to a ghost? In fact, it surprises me sometimes when I talk to other Christians, people who probably should know better, who say that they're absolutely terrified of ghosts. Really? I know Christians who technically, they understand, I know the Bible says, and I know that we're not really supposed to believe in ghosts like that, but I'll tell you what, man, a graveyard at midnight, or Old Man Jenkins' house or something, and I'm terrified. This season, the weeks leading up to Halloween, this is supposedly the scariest time of the year because of all the stories that we hear, because of the ghosts and the goblins, the ghouls, and the horror stories that have been passed down from generation to generation. And yet, a Christian should be free from those things. Christ says, you'll know the truth and the truth shall make you free. And I believe part of that is being free from fear of things that aren't real. In the book of 1 Corinthians, and I don't mean to take this out of the context of what Paul is trying to teach here, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, his conversation about eating meat sacrificed to idols, the apostle does make an interesting statement here. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and in verse 4, "Therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols, we know that there is no such thing as an idol in the world, and that there is no God but one." Now he's talking about God. He's talking about idols there, but I think there's a great application there. There is no such thing as witches. Now, maybe there is such a thing as witches, but the power that they have is not real. There is no such thing as demons. There is no such thing as UFOs. Well, there might be UFOs, but if they're extraterrestrial, I'd be very surprised by it. So I do believe it is worth our time to consider the biblical side of some of these things and to look for the holes in the arguments of a lot of these odd stories around this time. We'll start with ghosts, and we'll consider a few things about ghosts. The first thing I think we need to realize about ghosts is that anybody, and this is a good point that most people don't think about when they claim they believe in ghosts, anybody who claims to have seen a ghost must instantly forget any thoughts of atheism or evolution. Right? If you believe in ghosts, then you're also admitting that there is no such thing as atheism or evolution, or that those things are not true. Because you can't believe in a disembodied spirit and yet still believe in a scientific answer for everything. You cannot believe in a disembodied spirit and yet also not believe that there must be a supreme being in charge of that spiritual world. So, okay, right. If you're going to believe in ghosts, then that also means you have to let go of any thoughts of atheism or evolution. We need to point this fact out because the existence of ghosts automatically disproves man-made theories about our origins or what happens to us after we die. Consider also, look for the hole in the ghost story. Every time I hear a ghost story, even from Christians, they say, well, yeah, I know what you're going to say, Ryan. I know what you're going to say. But I was at this really creepy inn one time, the creepiest bed and breakfast, and a woman died during a cholera outbreak right in that room. And we stayed in that room, and I felt something chilly on my back. Look for the hole in the ghost story. Consider, most ghost sightings that take place in the world already are taking place at locations imbued with myth and legend. As in, there's already a built-in expectation. If I tell you that that house is haunted and then suggest that you go there in the middle of the night, the week before Halloween, what are you going to feel like when you're at the haunted house? When we build up expectations, human psychology fills in the blanks. Human psychology is going to tell us there are things there that are not actually there. Our minds will play tricks on us. Is it any surprise that a creaky, dank, dark house in the middle of the night is going to be scary? Ghost sightings are often coincidental also. They're based on nothing more than obvious information. People claim to see disembodied spirits in a house and then learn later on that an old lady died in that house. But guess what? If you're living in a house that's more than about 100 years old, it's almost certain that somebody died in that house. Because it's not like 150 years ago, it's not like people went to the hospital to die. There weren't a whole lot of hospitals, and the few that there weren't a lot of access to it. Most people, more than 50 to 100 years ago, most people died in their own homes. And so we but I learned later on a woman died in my house. Well, that's like every 100-year-old house, though, man. That's every 100-year-old house. And so we learn coincidental information along the way that sort of builds up the experience in our own minds. And the mind is a very funny thing at that. The mind is a very funny thing. You're telling me that you swear that you saw a head floating around in the dark. You swear it, right? You saw that. And yet this is the same human mind that suffers from amnesia, or phantom injuries, or psychosomaticism, that is, believing that you have a disease when you don't actually have that disease, or suggestion in advertisement. You know, my mouth is suddenly feeling parched. I could go for a Diet Coke. That same mind, forgetfulness, Or the same mind that believes that you ran an errand when in fact you didn't actually ever run the errand? When you tell your wife, but I remember going to the store for it. It's an interesting thing. Something happens, and I don't want to make light of this at all, that's not my point, but something happens typically when individuals lose a limb. In the first few days and weeks after a person loses a limb, they talk about feeling a phantom limb, where you can put the bedsheet back over your one leg and your missing leg, and you can still feel your toes wiggling. So you're telling me that that same human mind is reliable and trustworthy in the dark, in a creepy house, seeing a shadow. And you want to put some trust in that human mind? The human mind is a funny thing, and it does play tricks on us. And I find it very difficult to believe everybody when they have a ghost story. I think the practical application is this. Maybe if we didn't perpetuate ghost stories, we wouldn't have so much trouble with them. If we didn't tell ghost stories to our kids, would they ever come to believe in ghosts? If other children around the campfire didn't tell it to other kids, would they ever really believe in ghosts? Are ghost sightings and ghost stories reliable, trustworthy stories, or is it more a matter of perpetuating a falsehood? Now, beyond all of these practical observations, consider that the Bible has a few things to say about ghosts as well. Go to the book of Ecclesiastes, and we're going to notice two things from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 9. In Ecclesiastes 9, verses 5 and 6, observe what the writer says there. In Ecclesiastes 9, verses 5 and 6, "For the living know they will die, but the dead do not know anything. Nor have they any longer a reward, for their memory is forgotten. Indeed, their love, their hate, and their zeal have perished, and they will no longer have a share in all that is done under the sun." Now, he's not saying that when we die, that our souls are going to become forgetful, that we're not going to know who we are or where we are in the afterlife. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, as far as information and activity that is related to this world, when you die, that's it. When you die, you are not checking your email anymore. When you die, you don't get to read the news. When you die, you don't get to check on family members. When you die, your participation in this world is completely and utterly over. It's over. Go to verse 10 of the same chapter. "Whatever your hand finds to do, verily do it with all your might, for there is no activity or planning or wisdom in Sheol." That's the grave where you are going. And again, he's not saying that when we get to the afterlife, there won't be any kind of afterlife activity. I believe what he's saying is that as far as earthly activity goes, your participation in affairs of this planet that we can observe with our eyes or touch with our hands, that is over when you die. It's done. We also need to remember the story of the rich man in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. I think we know the story pretty well. For the sake of time, we won't read the whole thing. But in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31, there's an individual, a very rich man, who lived in splendor all the days of his life. And when he died, he was brought to the bad place, away from the presence of Abraham, where Lazarus was being comforted. Now this rich man screams out to Abraham. He says, "Father Abraham, this place is terrible. Can you spare a sip of water? Just a drop on my tongue?" Abraham says, "No." And the next thing that he requests is, "Well, at the very least, can I go back to my brothers, my family members, and can I warn them not to come to this place to make changes in their lives?" What is Abraham's response to this man? He says, "They have Moses and the prophets, and if they won't listen to them, then they won't listen to you either." Oftentimes with ghost stories, people will say, "He has unfinished business." He's in this world because he has unfinished business. The person, the jilted bride wanders around the house looking for her lover. You know, the widow up in the widow's peak of that house by the ocean, waiting for her seafaring husband to come home. There's always unfinished business. My biblical response to that is this. If God would not let the rich man come back to this life to preach the gospel to his relatives, God is not going to let anybody come back for a lesser reason than that. mean, that's the greatest reason of all. If God is going to let anybody come back as a ghost and teach people something, you'd think at the very least God would have let the rich man go back to preach the gospel to his family. But no. Not even the gospel is reason enough for God to allow a single soul to escape from the afterlife. Not only that, but remember in 2 Peter 2 and verse 4 and Jude verse 6, both of those verses mention the power that God has in imprisoning and confining even angelic beings under punishment. 2 Peter 2 and verse 9. Notice 2 Peter 2 and verse 9. Peter observes that God has the power to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. Ghosts are creepy, aren't they? And they're usually bad. There's always something negative about a ghost. And yet 2 Peter 2 verse 9 says that God has the power to keep every spirit under punishment. Nobody slips between His fingers. Nobody escapes His notice or escapes His grip. Death is death, and there is no reprieve. Hebrews 9 verse 27. And inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment. What about zombies? Sorry, that's like my favorite commercial right now. It's my favorite commercial. I will go out of my way to unmute the TV for the zombie Sprint commercial. I suddenly have the urge to buy a Sprint phone. It seems like zombies are everywhere right now, though. With the popularity of a television show in particular, movies that seem to come out every single year this time of year, zombie runs are becoming very popular right now. I applaud people who want to get out and exercise, but it's unfortunate that it would take a zombie apocalypse for you to get out and run a mile. Not only are they popular, though, but I will admit the concept of a zombie apocalypse is absolutely terrifying. It is a terrifying idea. They are incredibly scary. But should we really be afraid of them? Should we allow something that is completely imaginary to frighten us? I don't really think so. We'll always fear death. And I think that it's more death than the zombies itself that we are afraid of in a zombie TV show or a movie or in that concept. Death is an enemy. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 talks about how death is an enemy. Death is an intruder. It was not meant to be here. Death is unnatural. When you look in Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 11, it says that God has put eternity into the hearts of men. And what I think he means by that is that we have a built-in sense that we're supposed to be eternal beings. We have a built-in sense in our souls that we are supposed to exist longer than 75 or 80 or 85 years. We have eternity built into our hearts. And so the concept of death is very foreign, very unnatural to us. And as long as there is death in this world, it will always be seen as an encroachment upon the eternal nature that we feel within ourselves. So maybe it's not so much the zombies themselves, but the concept of death. That death can be personified as something that shambles around looking for others to consume. That can be very terrifying to us. Interestingly, humans have been dying for millennia now, and yet we always seem surprised by it. We're never comfortable with death. Death always comes as an interruption. And I guess in a way, then zombies might be our popcorn attempt at trying to cope with death. We root for the heroes in these movies because, like us, we do not want to see them defeated by death. Should the Christian really fear zombies, though? I think a lot of things we said about ghosts can apply to zombies as well. That God alone has the power over animation and reanimation in the human body. And there are plenty of examples that we have in the Bible. I'll list a few off for you. We don't have time to read them this evening, but if you're taking notes here, consider a couple of examples. In both the Old and New Testaments, individuals have been reanimated by the power of God. 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 17 through 24, and 2 Kings 4, verse 35, And in 2 Kings 13, verse 21, both Elijah and Elisha were given power by God to reanimate those who had died and passed from this physical existence. In Luke chapter 7, verses 13 through 15, in Matthew chapter 9, verse 25, we have examples like Jairus' daughter who was brought back from the dead. In John chapter 11, verses 43 and 44. And of course, the most notable example in Matthew chapter 27, verses 52 and 53, is Jesus Christ coming back from the dead. Consider Colossians 1 and verse 18. In Colossians 1, verse 18, we'll actually start back in verse 15 for context here. And He is the image of the invisible God, speaking of Christ, the firstborn of all creation. For by Him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created by Him and for Him. And He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church, and He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that He Himself might come to have first place in everything. Now, the writer of Colossians is not saying that Jesus was the first person ever brought back from the dead, because He wasn't. We just read a bunch of examples, or noted a bunch of examples, of other people who were brought back from the dead first. When he says He's the firstborn from the dead, he means firstborn in position. Firstborn, like firstborn in a family, the firstborn son. He's firstborn in preeminence. So when it comes to those brought back from the dead in the resurrection, Christ is the head of those resurrected. He is the firstborn of the body of those who are being raised from the dead. And when we live faithfully and follow the way of the gospel, we too will be part of that family. We too will be part of that body of resurrected people. I look forward to that day when we'll be raised from the dead. Zombie movies are very formulaic. The zombies come up from the grave, shamble around, eat a bunch of people, the humans fight back, and the credits roll. Very formulaic. It's very limited medium, actually. And I won't use the term zombie to describe those who have been brought back from the dead in the examples that I noted. And I certainly won't use the term zombie of Jesus Christ who was brought back from the dead. But I will remind us of one thing we noted in our point about the ghosts. In 1 Corinthians 15, death is an enemy, and Christ is the only one who defeats it for us. He has that power. Colossians 1:8, like we just read, or 1:18, like we just read, He is head over all things, and He alone has the power. And I know that these things might be terrifying to us in a fictionalized sort of way, but I wonder, why do we let our imaginations get the best of us when it comes to something that only God has the power to do, and in a form that God would never choose to do it in anyway? Maybe our fear then is not so much the zombies themselves, but what they represent. Insatiable consumerism, mob mentality, infectious disease, or life without law and order. And I think a lot of this comes from our failure to trust in God. Because if you trust in God, then it doesn't matter what happens to Western civilization. If you trust in God, it doesn't matter if a doomsday scenario ruins society as we know it. If you trust in God, it does not matter what the CDC says about something happening to the human race. If you trust in God, who has the power over all things, then you don't really have to fear anything that happens in this world. Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, because you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they're a comfort to me. It doesn't worry me what happens to this world. Well, we'll end our evening with UFOs. Extraterrestrial life would be a very interesting situation, but I don't believe it would be a dilemma for the believer. Now, I'm not saying I'm confident they're going to find a Mars worm or anything with the rover, but I will say this again, to reiterate. I do not believe that extraterrestrial life would be a dilemma for the unbeliever. And I've got several reasons why. First, some might say that if life exists on other planets, that it would somehow disprove the Bible. Like it would be some kind of crippling blow to those who believe in God. And yet, really, would it? Revelation 10 verse 6 talks about how God is the God of all things, the heavens and the earth. Colossians 1 verse 16 also mentions that same fact, that God really rules all things. And He rules the stars too, just as much as He does this planet. So if God wanted to put life on another planet, as advanced or otherwise as we can imagine, would it really hurt our belief in God? Really, might we actually rejoice at the fact that of the billions and billions of stars and inconceivable amount of planets in this universe, that God might take some of His time to put a little space worm on Mars, to give it something to do on that planet? God is the shepherd of this universe, after all. He holds all things together by His power. Doesn't God care at least a little bit, incidentally, about other planets? I don't really believe that we would encounter the kind of intelligent life that we tend to see in fiction. And I think that's an assumption that people make. People assume that if there is life on other planets, that it must be super intelligent life. They assume that if there's life on other planets, that it would just run circles around us as far as technology and philosophy and wisdom goes, and that we would look nothing like ape bumpkins compared to them. Yet that's a very odd assumption to make. And I think it cuts to the heart of what people are really looking for. People want E.T. to come and be their Savior. People want space aliens to come and teach us how to get along. People want a space alien to land on this planet and say, I have a doomsday device pointed at you all, and if you don't learn to get along and throw your nuclear weapons away, then I'm going to use it. And we would all go, oh, if it wasn't for the space aliens, what would we have done? What would we have done? It's like they want E.T. to come and teach us how to be humane to each other. Maybe how to love each other the way we love ourselves, or to love our neighbors. They want E.T. to come along and put others first. Wait a minute. Didn't that actually happen already? This is what I find interesting about extraterrestrial life, the expectation of people. They want UFOs to come and teach us how to be better people. And yet, again, in totally accommodative language, which I don't mean as disrespectful, an extraterrestrial being has already come to this planet and taught us everything that we need to know pertaining to life and godliness. And He taught us how to live a blessed life. And He taught us how to love our neighbor as ourselves. And He taught us how to put other people before our own selves. And He taught us how to judge not lest you be judged. And He taught us how to get along with each other. An extraterrestrial life already came and did that. And so I wonder why it is that so few people latched onto that extraterrestrial being and are sitting around waiting for another one to come. Jesus Christ came by the power of God and taught us how to live. And if you're waiting around for another alien to come, another extraterrestrial being, to teach you something else, you'll be waiting a long time unless the judgment day comes first, in which case a surprise is coming. Most UFO stories don't really add up anyway. When I read about UFO stories or see them on the news, most of the time the sightings are not very credible, at least not credible enough to be believed by a rational person. Why does every alien who visits this planet turn around as soon as his ship is seen by a corn farmer or truck driver? You know, it's always like, you flew 1 million light years to the planet Earth, and you saw a truck driver drunk outside of a tavern, and you got scared away by that? How come these space aliens never land? How come there's never direct contact? How come there's never at least enough curiosity to let us know that they're actually there? And I think that the last point that we would make, and again, going back to our point about evolution, consider this, and I'm not a math genius, but I'll give you a number that blows my mind. The mathematical probability of life spontaneously forming on one planet, the planet Earth, again, the mathematical formula of life spontaneously forming on one planet is 1 in 10 to the 1,000th power. That is a lot of zeros. 1 in 10 to the 1,000th power. If life spontaneously formed on another planet in this entire universe, it would be mathematically impossible. Personally, as far as a death blow to Darwinian evolution, nothing would tickle me more than if they found a little worm crawling around on the planet Mars. Because for life to spontaneously form on one planet, let alone two planets right next to each other, is mathematically impossible. So yeah, find a little worm crawling around on Mars, and we can just stop teaching Darwinian evolution altogether once and for all. I think we forget about that in our hurry to believe in these sorts of things. Now again, I hope that you felt like this was a useful lesson. I know that our primary goal is to teach Christ and Him crucified, and we do want to make sure that at this time we offer an invitation to anybody who might have need. It is important to remember, though, that the Christian should have an answer. A logical, practical, and biblical answer for the things that make unbelievers terrified. Unbelievers are afraid of the zombie apocalypse, but they don't probably spend a whole lot of time worrying about the actual apocalypse. Unbelievers are afraid of seeing ghosts, but they're probably not spending a whole lot of time worrying about seeing the Holy Ghost coming in all of His power. Unbelievers are terrified of UFOs, and so they play PlayStation 3 all day long blasting UFOs out of the sky, but they're probably not spending a whole lot of their time worrying about 1,000,000,000 billion angels blowing their trumpets in the heavens above us, calling forth the coming judgment of Jesus Christ. So the Christian needs to have an answer, so that the people of this world, when they hear us talk about the gospel, they learn not to be afraid of the things in their imaginations, but to fear the one who has the power over flesh and spirit. Now, if you're not a Christian here this evening, you really ought to be. This is your opportunity to obey the gospel call, summed up very nicely in Mark 16, verse 16. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. So whatever need you might have, please come forward as we stand and sing.